So good afternoon, everyone. I guess we can start. I just wanted to remind you that you can ask questions through the system. I think you know how it works, but you just need to connect to the OECD hotspot and then to Wisembly. And then you write the questions, and I will be able then to ask the questions to the panel. You can also write comments that I will be able to read, so that we can discuss your comments as well. Maybe we will start with you, Konstantin, to just frame the debate and tell us how do you see this the issue we're going to talk this afternoon on digitalization, inequality, and all the challenges that we face. Please, as you like. I mean,
does this work? Yes, it works. Good afternoon. Inequality, digitization, and competition. I don't know how you perceive the title, but when I heard it, I felt there was a certain bias in there, a certain bias towards inequality and digitization. That works. Digitization, competition, you can see the angle, but if you kind of put the three together, it kind of pushes us in a certain direction. So what I'm asked to do here is to basically frame this issue and see if we can pull it open in a way that we look at it in its actual terms.
Konstantin, if I may interrupt, we're going to have a poll. I forgot to say at the beginning and at the end of the session. So you can answer the question. The question is: should we do more to ensure fair competition? You answer
not a leading question.
No and don't know.
Okay.
So please vote now before we talk, and then we'll ask the same question again at the end, and we'll see whether people have changed their minds. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I like the word, little fair word in there. But it's an incredibly important subject, and it's really maybe even much bigger than the subject we're discussing today. It's about the power in the digitizing world and the influence that certain players have, and I think there are issues that come to mind, and it would kind of frame it for us, and maybe also for policymakers, is that you think of issues like who will actually control the truth and opinion. How will free choice develop itself? You know, what values, and what happens when artificial intelligence and IoT come in the fray, and who's going to control our lives, control the way we consume, control the way we communicate. So this is kind of the backdrop of this debate, and I think it's extremely exciting on one hand. It might be a bit scary. It's definitely an uncertain future. But I want to stress that this is actually not the debate we're having today. We are having a debate about a limited part of this discussion. It's about competition issues in digital markets that exclude economic actors from their customers or harm consumers. And do we need to regulate, and how would we regulate that? That's the actual question on the table. So we have to be sure that we know what we're talking about. Often in this debate we're discussing the power of platforms, and the concerns there are about the monopolistic tendencies of those platforms and online businesses, and mostly due to direct and secondary network effects, but also how these monopolistic tendencies might be replaced due to very rapid innovation cycles and new market entry. The resulting system of large platforms that de facto determine our access to the digital world, and our concerns about that. We also see the emergence of two-sided markets, and that create, on the one hand, a lot of social welfare and free services, and on the other hand, I find it very hard to fit those models in our existing competition policies. And that's one of the issues, is how do we actually deal with these concerns? How do we define what a market is. And what do we do? And do we want to look at this in an ex-ante perspective because we are creating opportunities, or are the ex-post tools that we have sufficient? And how do we find the balance between, on the one hand, allowing innovation to happen, and on the other hand, to control behavior that we find undesirable? But also between innovating on the platforms and the competition between them. And some of this discussion has been dominated, obviously, that the big platforms are mostly American, and therefore in some regions of the world we feel that is not fair. But the question is that something we need to regulate or not? So what should we really focus on? What are the issues? And I think the issues are, do you have access to your consumers? If you're a company and you have to work through these platforms, do you have access to those consumers? We should look at, are the consumers experiencing any harm by the behavior and the tendencies within the online digital economy? How much power is accrued by data, and how is that used effectively? And also, this is maybe a more difficult issue, the total invested sums in certain assets and resources like artificial intelligence, data analytics, machine learning, within a very limited number of companies. How is that affecting the ability of others to reach customers, and how to process data in a way that is fair and competitive? My question would also be, is there then, if we look at this question of regulation and need for regulation, is there any evidence of abuse? So, and if there is, are tools that we have, are they effective and are they sufficient? So we have, on the one hand, the ex-post enforcement that we know. The question is, the time that it takes to deal with these cases is so long that the competitive landscape has already changed, and there's a lot of effect also from the case itself. On the other hand, we might look at doctrines like the essential facilities doctrine to see if we can force companies to open up the data that they have. And these are the ex-post tools, but then ex-ante, should we regulate ex-ante? How do you anticipate these new developments? The risk of creating new barriers to entry might be good intentions that we regulate. On the other hand, the rules often are, and the compliance that come with it, are often very detrimental to especially the smaller companies, and those are the ones we then try to protect and create open markets for. And then are these ex-ante rules stifling innovation where we don't even know that innovation will come from down the line? And another point which comes up a lot in this discussion is about data protection and privacy. Is how far is that part of competition policy? Should we drag it in or not? And our data is already extremely heavily regulated. And how far do we go, and how far do we allow new business models to use data effectively? And do we want even more control than currently exists on privacy? So far, and I work a lot with startups, I don't hear many cries from startups that the current community, the platforms, are not providing them the access. In fact, markets that they're acting in didn't even exist without the platforms. The whole app stores where many thousands and even millions of companies have emerged didn't exist, and access to markets has been better than ever. So a lot has happened actually to the good. So far, the consumers are mostly happy too. We've seen Zalando, Spotify, others coming up beside Amazon and Apple and the other platforms. So there is a possibility to create, and then big players, obviously like Alibaba and others, to in a very small, short periods of time to come up. So there seems to be a lot of market dynamics there. The Commission itself, the European Commission, found that there were no clear barriers to entries for apps and app developers. There might be an issue. I think that might be the most relevant issue about platforms vertically integrating their service and then competing against companies that are on the platform and making it basically impossible to compete with them. So the vertical integration issue is definitely a point. And in closing, I just want to say that the issue is really important, we know that, but I do want to call on a certain level of restraint. And I think when you could say that when something is not broke, you shouldn't fix it. But also, but then what are the things that you should look at? And I think that if there are, for instance, low switching costs, or you have multi-homing, then that could be an indication that you don't need to regulate. If the network effects is not based on controlling a specific part of the network and a central parts network, then that's another indicator. If disruptive innovation is possible, and you see it happening, and if you have rapid innovation cycles, that might be another indicator that regulation is not the primary solution. And finally, if the consumers don't experience harm, and that might be a long discussion that we can have, what is harm and what not. You can always get something better and something cheaper. Then is there really a need to regulate? So my point would be, this is a really important issue. It's too important to get it wrong. So if it isn't broke, we don't fix it. If you don't know what is going to happen, if you don't know the dynamics of the markets going forward, then it's better to be humble about intervening in that market, because there are a lot of secondary effects that policymakers are less aware of, and especially when it concerns ex-ante markets. And I've been the head of cabinet of the digital commissioner in charge of the telecom markets. Anybody involved in telecom markets knows how complicated it is to do ex-ante regulation, and most of them you either become ex-ante yourself or you give up. And I don't think that it's an easy option to choose. But I would leave it there to you, and give it back to the panel. And I'm sure that that in this discussion there are so many complexities that we can definitely fill the next hour. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Constantin. There's one thing I'm pretty sure of, is that we won't reach a consensus on these issues on regulation and whether it harms or increases competition. Jacques, what's your take on this?
Yes, indeed. This is two complex questions to be solved in 1 hour, and I guess even I can make the bet, predictive analytics, as we say, that in 5 years we still have some people who will be saying no, some people will say yes. Now, the way I want to comment is on 3 points. One is that the question is so broad that I think it's important to go back to the basic facts. How large is the issue? The second question is, does it matter? I.e., do we have evidence that it's an issue? And number 3, so what? Assuming that it's an issue, what kind of tools do we have to correct, if any? If I take the very first one, and again on digitization, I think we all talk about digitization, and we all have the same sense, i.e. digitization takes, is quite speedy with a lot of innovation, and it makes us quite uncomfortable if somebody gets all the cards in his hands. But let me remind you that, in '92, 25 years ago, when I joined McKinsey, the first innovation was not the internet, it was a voicemail system. It took 3 years after that to get the internet, and it was a dial-up. And 25 years after that, we all talk about digitization. But if you look at digitization in terms of market share in total revenue across the globe, that's pretty much give and take between 15 to 20% of the revenue. 80% is still done or performed by incumbents. So it's still pretty much an analog world, despite the claim that we all believe that digital is so speedy 25 years afterwards. Now, it's not to say that 20% does not matter. Again, if an aggregate is 20% in every market, that's pretty much the equivalent of being a number 2 or number 3 player in the market, so it's significant. And on top of that, the key question on the 80% of companies that make up the rest of the revenue, how much of that is digital? Possibly 20% of that. So 20% of 80, if you make a math, 16 versus 20, that means in pure digital, indeed, the digital entrant is past the tipping point of being dominant. And that's sometimes a debate. Is the market digital or is the market the full-fledged? And again, if you look at the full-fledged, you have a different perspective. It's not dominant, it's 20%, and it raises an interesting question, which is why incumbents, having 80% of their revenue still analog, are not that eager to transform themselves to digital. Because if you believe there is something of an unfair competition, it's in the hope of making more profit. So if you are in the hope of making more profit, maybe you should try to act upon trying to innovate and at least absorb this business model. And the facts are, if we take platforms, most of the platforms, as a matter of fact, the statistics are quite staggering. For one platform that you see in the classical traditional companies, you got 20 coming from digital entrants. So again, my question is, are we measuring the right thing, yes or no, and is it relevant? The same thing comes into the same evidence. Yes, some players are big, and possibly they have what we call a dominant position. Again, dominance is only an aspect of regulation. You first have to prove that that dominance distorts competition, and that's what it's called abuse. Now, again, it's very complex because the economic of these platforms are multi-sided. On top of that, are we talking about competition at the level of the horizontal competition, vertical competition alike, and it's what makes the problem extremely complex. I will argue that if you have 50 million SMBs on the platforms like Facebook able to export the next day because of outsourcing everything to the platform, it's possibly a great innovation platforms and actually more competition among SMB. Are we talking about the platform owner? Are we talking about the application side? Are we talking about infrastructure? These are questions that today people are getting confused because we are too generic about that question. And the matter of the fact, again, today is that globalization and digitizations are coming out of data, are coming quite fast, but still are not yet at the level of being dominant in the world. That's number one. Point number two, if this is what's the issue, do we have evidence of market distortion? And there I resort to economics and academics. Again, we all know that in every market, there is always an incentive for some people to beat a bit of the market rules. And sometimes, even myself, in my second hat as a McKinsey consultant, we try to shape the market. The question, is it wrong or not? I don't know. But if you look at information, obviously, the myth is obviously information costs will go to zero because of the internet. And that means in this world, there is no exercise of market power because there is no asymmetry. The question is that we assume that if this information is available to everyone, people can use it and exactly know what this information value is. And the fact is that nobody knows. Just look at the information value in the stock market of many companies. You see very different market valuation, which is a symptom that nobody knows what the exact value is. So again, yes, there is scope for discrimination, scope for possibly market power, but again, I'm not judgmental about it. I don't know the answer. We just have to be careful. Then came the last questions. Assuming we are careful, should we go for the hammer? Should we basically regulate? And again, there it's like my questions to my kids. Should I punish them anytime they do something wrong? And it's possibly the way they will think about me in 20 years' time as, you know, the bad father. Now, sometimes there's many ways to discipline, to coach, to do things. And again, regulation is possibly a way to show that we cannot actually act upon the rules of making competition possibly fair. And that's my learning. I believe that innovation is coming through digital. I don't want to kill the golden goose, but the goose is possibly not golden for everyone, so we have to be careful, but the goose is still the goose. So I don't know the answer, but my voice here is, let's be careful. Two questions. Is the market well defined? Are incumbents in this market actually not playing the game to the extent potential that they create innovation for the benefit of the consumer? And three, even if we believe some people benefit more than the other ones? Is it because they are misbehaving versus actually creating the right innovation? I'm still on the side of saying, until not proven, innovation is usually something that I applaud because it's welfare enhancing.
Thank you. There are lots of there are lots of very interesting questions already coming up, but before we take these questions, I would like to ask Roxanne. You know, Constantine said we don't hear many startups crying against platforms, and you're in touch with startups every day. That's your job. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think my approach to this whole thing will be from a very startup entrepreneur angle. I agree with what you said in the beginning. We're going to talk about this for a whole hour. I don't think anyone's going to come to an agreement at the end. But I do think it has a lot to do with what Constantin said in his presentation about kind of finding the fine line between allowing for innovation to happen and actually regulating what needs to be regulated. And I think I come at this probably from a similar feeling to what is in the entrepreneurial and startup sector. I'm relatively very positive and optimistic when it comes to, you know, what has technology done for us. And I feel that, you know, it's lowered a lot of the costs and it's given people access to a lot of new services and things that they didn't have access to before in a lot of different areas. So I think overall I'm relatively positive, but I think also when we look at what regulations tend to be applied to in the kind of startup realm, I mean, you have examples, for example, Airbnb or Uber. Yes, they maybe touch some of these kind of bigger, badder corporations or what have you, or startups that are growing and they can handle it, but actually oftentimes we also end up hindering a lot of really small startups, and we have a lot of examples. For example, in France, you know, going after Uber also touches a lot of very smaller, younger competitors that are in the ground and not exactly doing the exact same thing as Uber. So I think my approach to this tends to be we really need to be careful with the messages we're sending as well, because in many ways the messages behind regulating can also really hinder innovation.
Thank you. Ariel, there's a good one for you here, and I'd like to hear your comment about the fact that large platforms are mostly American is due to innovation. Greater regulation will not promote greater innovation. Do you agree with that?
So, it's a big question.
Yes, indeed.
I want to say a few, if I may, before I answer directly that question, a few words that might actually provide a comment. And I think the starting point is that, and this is something I'm sure we all agree, no one wants to jump into conclusions, and no one is arguing that we should regulate or do something which would put the market under some sort of distress and might actually undermine innovation. I think this is all agreed. The question is exactly what do we do about it? And when we approach that question, there are differences in policy, differences in our view about what is the market like, whether the market is truly competitive or not, and also there are differences in the toolbox that is available to various jurisdictions. So there are three elements, and I just very briefly want to cover all of them. First, in terms of how competitive is the market. The question is, what are the counterfactuals? In other words, what are you comparing it to? No one here wants to go back 10 years to a time when you wanted to buy your holiday, you had to go to your corner shop, and they will tell you whatever they want, and you'll get a holiday, and you'll realize later on that it wasn't a good deal. We all appreciate all the benefits that we get from the internet, so that's obvious. The issue is whether today the environment we have is truly competitive, or whether, because of certain issues with respect to the structure of the market, the way we approach the market, we are enabling some very powerful operators to engage in practices that actually transfer wealth from our pockets as consumers to their pockets. And here, when you think about these themes, then you start to understand what it is that we're actually trying to explore. It's a much more narrow question. The question is whether what we have today is the best we can get, whether there are some forms of intervention that could be implemented that could maybe improve our environment. And here, just to give an example, if you think about how competitive is the market, in theory, the internet would be the closest thing we have to perfect competition. Endless sellers, almost absolute access to information. And yet, in reality, we all appreciate that we have a few gatekeepers. We have many times asymmetric information. We have companies that are able to exercise some sort of market power. I will, on purpose, avoid the question of whether they're dominant or not, although if you believe the European Commission, then certainly in some instances they have found a position of market power. But even if you say that this is not the classical market power, we have companies that are able to leverage their power, able to affect the way we access the market, the way sellers access the market, and also able to affect the disruptive innovators. In other words, those gatekeepers are able not only to deal with upstream and downstream elements, but also to identify horizontal threats and deal with them through various means. So the market is great. We're all benefiting from it. But I would argue to begin with that it's certainly not as perfect as some people believe it to be. And that is significant because that should affect your trust in the market ability to correct itself. That should affect the trust that you give in just dynamic market powers and your appetite for actually inquiring more. And this is important. It is about inquiring more and learning more about the market rather than saying, okay, so let's jump in with intervention. Then the policy question comes along. And here the question for us is, how can we design a regime that enables innovation, enables investment, but by doing that, in parallel, also safeguards consumer welfare? And here we will have a massive range of opinions. I would say that when we deal with the policy, then we shift very quickly to the third issue of what it is that we're talking about. Now, regulation, different people here might have different ideas about what we mean when we say regulation, but generally speaking, we speak about a regime that is relatively rigid and many would argue is not exactly adequate for fast-moving markets. So maybe we're thinking more about some sort of intervention. And even here, as we heard at the beginning, we can divide this to ex post or ex ante intervention. And just to give a flavor, and in our book, Virtual Competition, Maurice and I cover various ex ante measures, but one of them would be, for example, to deal with very basic issues that should not affect the incentive of companies to innovate, but could empower us as consumers. How about we allow data mobility? How about we empower consumers by giving them more control over privacy? And I'm speaking about real control, not the fact that all of us tick yes to whatever terms and conditions we are being fed when we download an app. How about we deal with asymmetry of information? For instance, when you are told that a certain product costs a certain amount, what if we will require the seller to actually inform you what was the average price that that product was sold today? And when most of you will realize that you are actually charged way above the average price, will you actually buy? Should we allow companies to benefit from asymmetric information that they were able to create just because they own the interface or they were able to control it? Which brings us back to the policy question. Do you believe that these are competitive problems? Do you believe we should care about distribution of wealth in society? Do you believe equality is a value that we should protect? Or do you believe that as long as we have a pie that grows, we shouldn't care that it is 1% that benefits from it, because overall, through various instruments, we will all benefit eventually. And these are important policy questions, and I'm sure the different people here will have different views about it. Which brings us then to the question that you asked, why is it that those companies are from North America in particular? I'm sure there are many explanations, many positive and many negative. I can only highlight one which I think is interesting, which is the regulatory regime, which would actually serve as a convincing argument at the industrial level to say we should not regulate, we should remove taxes because we want Europe maybe to reach that level. But I would also say that in our global regime, in our global environment, it is these days possible, and we will see that I believe in the next few months, when we will have the Google decision, it is possible for one agency to affect the behavior of companies, even if those companies are not based in that jurisdiction, because what we focus is on the implementation or the effect of the activities. But the matrix behind the reasons that those companies stem from there is much more complex than that. I don't assume that it's only because of that. You have vast differences, both in terms of market structure, in terms of who are the drivers in the economy, level of state intervention, and no matter how you look at it, market structure in Europe is very different from market structure in the UK, which should, to some extent, give us an indication why you find such differences in approach between the US and the EU.
There's another model that was raised by one of the participants here. It's about China. China also has very large platforms, and is it due to innovation there or to protectionism?
Who do you want to?
Yes, Konstantin.
It's both. So you can first say that first we looked at WeChat and said, oh, that's a Facebook copy. Then what they've been able to innovate on the platform has been phenomenal, has overtaken Facebook in an incredible pace. And yes, you can say there have been certain protective mechanisms. Some of these big internet platforms actually have developed outside of the state system much more, and the state came in later. So, for instance, with the competitor to Uber, there it was clear that, you know, about when Uber got their permits and who was investing in the companies, that there was a strong bias against Uber. But for the big internet platforms, they didn't come from the traditional system, and they've played the venture capital game, and they've been invested by non-Chinese investors. And they have followed a very kind of similar, very rocky path, and they've been incredible innovators. So I think it's a bit of both. The obvious advantage is that in China you didn't have credit cards. You have it's basically a leap into the new technology, and these companies were on the cusp of that leap. And then obviously then there's also the state with the wall. I mean, protecting Baidu against Google. I mean, obviously they kept the American platforms out, but platforms that were in, like Yahoo and Amazon, didn't fare very well. And it was also because they just didn't understand the Chinese market and the Chinese customers, and they were run out of first out of Silicon Valley, and with a certain American arrogance that didn't chime very well with the customers. So
it's more that kind of reason than protectionism then.
On these companies, yes, there are other companies. You can look at Huawei, and there are many companies that you might say that there was a much stronger involvement of the state. But in these cases, they have actually evolved relatively outside of that system. And if you go to China, what is striking is just the sheer volume of entrepreneurs. And it's for a Chinese entrepreneur, it's also really difficult to make it. It's for a non-Chinese to come in the Chinese market is maybe more difficult, but it's definitely not easy for a Chinese entrepreneur to make it in the Chinese market. So if you do, I mean, you've had to jump through so many hoops already, and you've been so creative to pivot your business that actually once you've established yourself and you start getting traction in the market and you're getting, you know, tens, 20s, and hundreds of millions of users, then you've fixed a lot of the bugs. And then and then if your appetite is beyond going to China, then, and I think we will be seeing that in the coming years, and we've seen those platforms also coming to other parts of the world, and you see that they have been innovating like mad.
Would you say, by the way, that those Chinese platforms actually help foreign companies access the Chinese market?
Yes, absolutely. But I think the common wisdom is, if you really want to go into the Chinese market, you have to actually be in the Chinese market. So selling into it over an Alibaba platform or a Tencent platform is not an end game.
Jacques, you wanted to add something?
Yes, I think the question is a good one, and again, it's yes and no. But I think what is very striking when you go to China again is that they've been clever enough to not necessarily do just the duplication of what we see in the B2C platforms. They're obviously the leaders in B2B. And remember, in 2000 and the first hype of the internet, all Europeans and all US people were all jumping into B2B, and it was possibly the biggest bubble behind the B2C at that time. And then we all giving up on that B2B marketplaces. And obviously, B2B was invented back again from the learnings of what happened in the first waves in China, and China is actually owning pretty much all the verticals in B2B, which is quite worrisome because 90% of our trade is actually not on the B2C side, on B2B side. So again, I think we always claim that China is actually not playing fair. I will say they're actually quite outsmarting us in the sense that they take the B2B where nobody wants to compete while we're focusing on the B2C side. And at the same time, they start to own all the platforms. If you look at the data layers and you look at the data flows across the globe, across countries, and you really do the social networks element to it, you see that there are two hubs that really matters in terms of global flows of data. One is, close to my heart in Belgium, close to Belgium, which is Holland, but the rest is nowhere in Europe. And the second one is actually China. So again, they do things that are very entrepreneur, that are very clever, and obviously they are in a culture of both centralizing and decentralizing and sometimes protecting. That's fair. But again, what is worrisome is not the point that, hey, they try to protect and do things. The point is that these guys have a way to innovate that, at least in Europe, we don't seem to have. So the question is not whether the US are the bad guys and the Chinese the bad guys. I always come back to the other way, is why is it so that in Europe we don't have so many of these companies? We have a lot of small medium enterprise that are doing quite great. And again, that's not country driven, it's pretty much city driven. If you think at AI, what's happening in Zurich and London, if you think about, the Internet of Things, and you see cities like Stockholm and the like, there you see the ecosystem to work. So again, the point here is that it's not something that comes that comes out of vacuum. There is a system behind that. The system is not always likely fully competitive, but again, the endowment, the way, the best practice to make it happen makes that we should say, well, China, kudos for what you have done.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add another angle, which just an interesting angle. One other element that you can throw into the mix is network effects. And the fact that in China, what you had is a network that basically is almost a closed network in so many ways when we deal with social networking and so forth. So this is why you have such a story of success. Whereas if you look at Europe, because of cultural issues, we're actually part of a wider network. So we're using a network that is provided by another country, let's say, or organizations in other countries, where culturally we're very close to them, and therefore we can use that, which might explain why those networks, so if I'm looking at social networks, were able to gain such prominence in our environment, and which would explain to you also why once you're able to reach that level, when you have access to the data and you have the smart algorithms, why then all you see then are the small and medium-sized players, because in many ways, they were not the first. And there is a beautiful phrase that was coined by Peter Thiel when he said, in the new era, competition is for losers. And he said it in the context of PayPal at the time. And so I'm not attributing this now to him in the context that we're describing it, but something interesting does happen in our environment that goes into disruptive innovation and so forth, that if you are able to have a first move advantage and to actually capture something and create network effects and able to defend them and protect them, it is much harder to destabilize you. And therefore, when you do look down, for you, you see the competition, but it is a bit away from you. It doesn't affect you as dramatically. Of course, disruptive innovation can come up any day. The whole idea is that we don't know what it may be. But just in terms of maybe providing another element into the mix that you described.
Just linking back to my first discussion, we're talking a lot about is competition, leaders too strong and anti-competitive versus are the other guys too weak? And possibly they are weak because simply they have the skill, the assets, but they don't have the skills to develop that. If you think about social networks, the biggest social networks in Europe happens to be the telecom guys, obviously, because that's, you know, the way you talk is abuse the networks. Who from the telecom guys have been able to pull it off and just the social network capabilities? And again, that's the evidence as well that we should, again, not look only at the potential of de-risking, but again, the innovation is obviously quite important. And I will argue that in many markets, the winners, the way they've come to be the leader, has not necessarily been because they were the first mover and life was easy. In sometimes the incumbents had a lot of assets, didn't exploit them. And again, if you look at what's happening on the search side, the mobile search today is pretty much on the innovation side, much more on the on the Chinese side than the US side, because obviously they leapfrog on the mobile side much stronger than what's happening in the US, not to quote the search guys in the US. But that obviously leads to the discussion about why are those US companies all buying these AI companies? It's not only to control the market, it's also as a way to defend what they've built. So the first move advantage is also important, but the contestability of this market is not 100% there, but it's not 0% either.
I would agree with that, absolutely.
Well, I think there, if you look at the companies that we're always referred to, there are very few of them. And they see what kind of strategies they're deploying, their portfolio strategies, and because they also don't know where the competition is going to come from. So it's not a kind of a focused strategy in that sense. So there is a lot of uncertainty also for those companies. Big companies that were the platforms have disappeared. I mean, we've seen Twitter obviously got an unexpected bump because of someone that rhymes with bump, but was on its way out. We've seen Groupon being up there, going out. So it's not that the American companies are having a very easy ride, and they have a much more venture backing as well. So they have a lot of capital, they can actually grow. But there are only very few that make it to a level where they can start to consolidate. And as you say, they're buying all these assets and resources. I mean, I think Uber bought a whole department hired a whole department of Carnegie Mellon artificial intelligence experts because they need to actually consolidate that their position. So it's not that the world is safe for them. And actually, we shouldn't kind of always discount Europe. We've got Spotify, which has been able to play the game. They have. They had a much more difficult position to start off from because they had to conquer market after market, getting licenses for copyright, whereas the deep pockets of Apple basically could run through Europe, and they did it. They didn't go as fast as they could because they were basically segregating the markets, but they had the means. And our companies don't, and that's something we can blame ourselves. We don't have an internal market in that sense, and you really have to go market by market if you want to be a European player, or you first have to go to the US, get scale, and then come back. But we saw Booking.com. Why did they succeed? Because they ensured compliance at the start, but they needed a US investor to take them to the next level. They're now, I think, something like a 60 or 70 billion dollar company, and they're much, they're 80% of the mother company that bought them. So we see Adyen as a new payment company. So and they are going to be the payment provider for the world. That's a Dutch company. We see WeTransfer. So we're seeing a lot of developments in Europe that are going in the same way. If they manage to sustain their growth, if they have the same kind of drive that the companies in Silicon Valley have, we're going to see them from Europe too. But it is evident that we in Europe, we have different linguistic areas, we have different cultural areas, we have different legislative and judicial systems, and compliance is an issue. So there are many more barriers to that rapid growth, and we don't have the same depth of venture capital to back that kind of growth up.
It's also a question of access to capital. It's
absolutely.
I would say actually in terms of access to capital, we've probably come a long way in the last 5 years or so, at least in the French ecosystem. A few years ago, it was early stage funding that was a huge problem, and nobody could get funding in the beginning of their companies. They didn't know what to do. And I think there was a study that came out that last year, actually, France, and I give Brexit a little bit of credit for making that situation easier for us, but France was actually ahead of the UK and Israel, even in terms of early stage, or the number of rounds closed. So that's not in terms of overall volume of funding raised, but companies were actually able to gain that access to capital. And today I think we're struggling in Europe is probably more in the growth phase, but that's a pan-European problem. It's not actually a French or a German or what have you problem. So I think that's something that we really need to dive deeper into. But I did also want to follow up on what Konstantin was saying. I think a lot of the times we tend to look at a lot overseas, and we mentioned that with China, for example. Do we just put a barrier down and we just make copycats of everything? And I think the reason, for example, WeChat has been so successful is because they have innovated, not because necessarily the Chinese government has facilitated that for them. And the proof is that even companies like Facebook went and got inspiration from them, and that's why they purchased WhatsApp. So I think we really have to focus on driving innovation ahead of regulating. And I also think that when it comes to innovating in Europe, a lot of the times we don't actually innovate around European model. And yes, we have hugely fragmented markets and what have you, but there's a company, for example, I think BlaBlaCar exemplifies this really well. BlaBlaCar's model would not work that well in the US, where cities and transportation are not organized in the same fashion. And that is why they've gone to literally every other market in the world, and they've done very, very well, because literally the same type of transportation services would not function the same way in the US. So I think we really also need to look at kind of fostering people to look at what are the local problems, what are the local issues, how can we scale those, how can we sometimes overcome these barriers that we have. And in Europe, we have numerous barriers that just kind of block at every level. But I do think companies are overcoming that.
Yes, there's one issue we didn't talk much about, although it was in the title of our session, which is inequality. And the issue here is whether, and it's a big debate, whether digital is actually increasing inequalities, in the sense that some people have a better knowledge, and that then you have this digital divide that increases, or is digital, on the contrary, contributing to reduce inequalities? What would you say on that? Ariel.
Yeah, maybe I can offer a few thoughts. I think you can see positives and negatives, like in everything. Digital provided us all with greater knowledge and greater access. So in that respect, you could link this to equality, although empirical research suggests that in terms of the division of welfare in society, it is not exactly supporting equality. Part of it is at the personal level, where you will see that people that are wealthier and more educated will actually have access to tools and instruments that would benefit them, whereas some people will stay outside of the loop of the digital and therefore will not gain access to these things. And it can be the simplest thing, you walking with your mobile, getting a coupon because you just stood outside a certain shop that enables you to benefit from a discount that someone else will not. It can also be just the way that algorithms work in the background. If I'm using dynamic pricing and I want to acquire you, which means gain your loyalty, I will actually give you, as an educated and maybe better off individual, a greater discount that I would give to someone that, based on the key data points that I have, I assume is not wealthy and not educated. And the reason is the way that I actually assume the totality of profit that I can make out of that individual. So you can argue that. There's also a separate discussion on inequality, which is not equality when it comes to individuals, equality when it comes to businesses and opportunities. And here, I think maybe just one comment on that. There is a difference between the fact that anyone here in this room can be online tomorrow and have your own business, which is great if we speak about access, and the question of whether that has been an effective access. In other words, whether beyond the fact that we can all very easily reach that domain and be part of this landscape, whether on that landscape we have any chance as early company, without massive investment, deep pockets, and some sort of vertical integration, actually reach the audience, reach the customer, because of the way information, search, and other key junctions operate at the moment.
Yeah, sorry. No, go ahead.
So I was going to jump on the back of that and just say, actually, we had a discussion in an earlier panel that was somewhat similar about the access to entrepreneurship and the access to some of these tools. And I think that's a perfect point, that everybody can literally jump online and do the same thing, but not everybody's going to be successful at it because people have different access to resources and what have you. And I think part of what we're also seeing today is maybe the entrepreneurs and the kind of stuff that's coming out of places like Silicon Valley or some of these big hubs is starting to look very similar, because we have investors that are kind of investing in similar networks and similar people, similar profiles. Everybody's getting a Stanford, MIT MBA, and those are the people that they're funding. And so I think we really also have to think about encouraging new forms of entrepreneurship, and I think it's something that really hasn't been done yet. We're also not reaching out to new types of entrepreneurs that today, you know, we have a very kind of homogenous population that is creating the products of tomorrow. So I would argue that that's also something that is potentially driving inequality. And also, this was a topic from earlier as well, that profit doesn't always line up with some of the greater goals of the world, like decreasing inequality. And how can we line those objectives up so that companies will actually go in that direction?
Yeah, I think access to contacts is probably more, access to market is not such a problem. I mean, I have not experienced that. I think when it's access to knowledge about entrepreneurship, much more than the technologies are there. They've never been so cheap. Companies that we've been talking about, the platform companies are reaching out to startups to use their tools to provide AI for free. I mean, some of these companies put their IP for open. I mean, like Tesla, they have provided their IP because they want more companies to enter in the game. So that's not the issue. The issue is much more access to networks, access to corporates, to clients, to capital, to talent. You know, those are the things that really are the bottleneck, especially with a fast scaling company. Talent is a real issue. Also, I think you can look at macro figures and see that there's definitely there are wealth distribution effects. But if you look at, for instance, what happened in Africa with M-Pesa and other, you know, making mobile really creating a lot of wealth and opportunities that were not there before. So I think that's something that should be noted. And finally, when you look at the policies of these issues, what I find amazing, and I can't stress this enough, but that governments that are concerned with this, about wealth and the digital divide and all this, are not investing in bringing coding into schools and the 21st century skills, entrepreneurship skills. Because if there's one domain that the privileged schools are not touching, it's exactly that. You can actually give underprivileged kids from underprivileged social backgrounds the digital tools to be extremely successful, and they can outpace many of the, all of our beautiful, traditional schools that are teaching very beautiful Latin and all that. Give a kid, even at 4 years old, give them a course in Scratch, and they can actually design and start coding themselves. At 10 years, they can code to a degree. They can already build something, can build a service. If you give them that kind of skills, and you do that in a focused manner, you can actually overcome some of those divides and actually give them tools that the other kids, the privileged kids, don't have. Because we parents, I'm from a very privileged background, and I put my kids in try to get them in the best schools, and they get the best Latin, and they might in the best schools even get some Chinese. But you ask them for coding and said, no, that's modern. You teach them one language, a computer language, 1 year, and then there's a next computer language the next year. So it's not worth of doing that. And to those policymakers and teachers, I'd say, you're really disallowing the next generation to become digital producers, and you're condemning them to become digital consumers.
We have a new Minister of Education here in this country, so he's looking for fresh ideas, so maybe he will jump on that. More generally speaking, do you think that in this European market, we talked about Europe earlier, which is very fragmented, what do we need to do to increase entrepreneurship, and are there any measures that this continent should take to improve the way digital is developing in this continent?
Well, I think you mentioned it. It's what is extraordinary. When we in 2010 we launched the digital strategy, and we just could not get the message across that digital is a horizontal technology, that it's a phenomenon that's going to touch every single sector of the economy, of society. And people said, no, you're telecoms, you're vertical. And it took us until 2013, thanks to Mr. Snowden, that it became a political issue. But our politicians were just not engaging with the topic. And that's different in other parts of the world where engineers are also part of the political establishment or the government. And I think now we're seeing Industry 4.0, and I think Industry 4.0 is kind of the awakenings that was 2010. You know, IT coming to all parts of the economy, and we're going to see sensors, and we're going to see data driving processes. But that is a BMW with a lot of technology. That does not design either the Tesla or a car sharing platform. That was not kind of figured into the idea of Industry 4.0. So I think even there we should look further, and we should look at investing much more in innovation, much more, and also enabling the disruptive innovators, and not only looking at the incumbents. Because I fully agree with you. You know, the telecom market. If you are that's the networks that on which all of this is running. It's the internet, all of these services, and why is it so difficult for them, you know, to innovate on top of that? You know, we had SMS, you know, and we're complaining that suddenly there is a WhatsApp comes up, and WhatsApp is bought for $19 billion, and there are only 100 people working there. It was considered unfair. It's not unfair. Is it providing a service that people really love? And so we have the technology companies, but maybe because of regulation, we've created market barriers, market entry barriers, and they have a market laid out for them. We were in endless negotiations about all of this ex-ante regulation because nobody knows this regulation better than the telcos. Instead of forgetting about the regulation, thinking about innovation and how innovation can actually deal with many of these issues, and we can have a thriving technology business in Europe, we were only looking at controlling and at using our regulation to try and manage the issues that we were seeing. And we actually, with every regulation, we're creating a next series of problems that we would then try to regulate away. And I think that's something that cannot be a model for the future.
Yes. I don't think we should say that entrepreneurship is not vivid in Europe. It's definitely there. I think there are a few macro conditions that we just have talked about, which are a bit more challenging because of the fragmentation, the language, and everything else. But I also think that we should, again, as I said, 80% of the market is not yet digitized. So there's just a lot of potential, and I hope Europe will catch up quite easily on that. But we have to go back into resetting the mindset of even some industries. I mean, we all know that with automation and AI, the two sectors where you will see the largest disruptions, it's no longer the B2C, it will be manufacturing and possibly agriculture. Because with smart agriculture has tons of challenges in agriculture. So if you think about meat, fish, and everything which is fresh, where do we see entrepreneurs in those domains? If you see the VCR moving quite fast into these two domains, but I don't see a lot of entrepreneurs, frankly, trying to tap into that money. And we start to see VC saying, look, I'm happy to give you the money, but I just don't see the file to do it. So again, I think it's important to realize, yes, there are just a lot of people, but they just have to make sure they shift gears towards not what they've seen somewhere else, but where the opportunities will lie, and be slightly more foresighted. And I think, I'm not saying Europe is bad on that. I think the US and maybe China is not as good either. But the point is that the opportunity is there, so we should lament about it. We should just jump on the new opportunities coming from there.
Yeah, I wanted to also just jump on a little bit what Constantin was saying earlier, because I think that, for example, just to address the question that you asked earlier about the homogenization and what can be done to kind of help get over some of the fragmentation, I mean, we do have a lot of initiatives in place. We have the project for the single digital market, and I'm sure they're doing lots of great things we don't know about. But I also think that a lot of the answers, as he mentioned, will actually come from entrepreneurs. And I think those tend to be some of the more successful ones, is when you actually integrate entrepreneurs or business people into the process. And I think probably the best example of this that I can see was when Nicholas Zenstrom launched the Alliance for the Scale-Ups in Europe, picking scale-ups from many different countries around Europe to start to address these problems that are completely overlooked today by all the policymakers, have no idea what scale-ups were at the time, and they're just talking about startups because that started to finally enter the dialogue. And so I think we really need to integrate a lot more people into the process of what we're doing, and I think that's really where we're going to start to find the solutions.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe just to link to something that was discussed and also link it to the market structure. I think we do have innovation, and you will see a lot of innovation, but one of the problems, at least, that I see from competition law perspective, or when it comes to the competitiveness of the markets, is that most of this innovation has to then survive or exist on a platform. And what we don't have is a wealth of platforms that are useful, platforms that are, and this is where we might have in the future issues. Because if what you've done is good and useful and there is money, then it is very likely that either you're a disruptive innovator, I will purchase you as the platform, or I will leverage my market power and basically create a same operation downstream but will favor my own operation. So part of the problem that we have is that even when you have all these exciting initiatives, because in the digitalized world, they don't exist in a vacuum. They have to exist on a platform. They have to exist on your mobile phone. We have 2 leading operating systems. Maybe we'll have a third one that will push in. But it's just important for us to accept that there are almost 2 levels. The level of innovation, but it's innovation that then has to be implemented through a platform. And if one of those leading platforms will decide to vertically integrate and, for instance, have its own ride-sharing services, then many of the most successful ride-sharing companies might face real difficulties. If one of those platforms will decide to downgrade in probability to one of the social platforms, you will have real issues. In fact, if you look at the shareholders' reports, many of the companies, the public companies, when they list the risks they face, one of the main risks that they will highlight is the risk that one of the platforms will have enough of them. Because the ecosystem is controlled. It's like having only one shopping mall owned by one company. Think about Hong Kong in a way. When someone actually owns the land, that someone can determine what exactly you get when you walk into that mall. So the space that we talk about, the landscape, is different in that respect from the landscape that we imagine here. And this might be an element that could undermine the ability of innovators to grow and the ability of innovators to effectively access the market.
I think there you're touching on something really important because these big platforms have become the main exit strategy of most digital companies. So you see very little IPOs at size, and you being purchased by any one of the big companies is the strategy. So, and that's not a problem. I mean, if you bring more AI capability to Facebook, that I mean, that's in a sense that's fine. Obviously, if you are if the platform starts to vertically integrate and start to compete in an unfair way, because all the data is integrated and they're getting the access to these vast resources that the platform has, then I would say there is a case to look at very carefully, because there that power is used to push others out of the market. We've seen an example of Twitter with I think it was Meerkat, I think it was called, and then they Twitter decided not to go with Meerkat but with their competitor, and they're just gone. I mean, after some very successful funding rounds, a company that was in high demand of investors suddenly just disappeared, and that definitely is an issue that we should be aware of. The platform actually have that kind of power.
I mean, in many ways, they hold the oxygen supply. So if one of those platforms then demands that you will use their payment system, what it does is, A, it empowers that platform and channel more funds, but also kills all the other innovators that have payment systems. If you think about that and advertisements, it will have the same effect. So the ability to leverage power sometimes can be very obvious, and this is when maybe you will have enforcer intervene. But many times what you can do is engage in much weaker forms that all they do is just give themselves a certain edge. And instead of having some sort of a turning point, when it's very clear that at that turning point you basically prevented someone from accessing a market or excluded a competitor, what you do is over time you're weakening the competition. And you're weakening the competition in various ways. If that process continues, looking ahead, we are likely to find much more vertically integrated providers. Because what they do is when they see profit, they move into that space. And they exclude or weaken the competition. Some people might say that's efficiency. Some people might say that's anti-competitive. I mean, we go back to the policy question where you might have different views on how legitimate this is. But somewhere on that spectrum, I think we need to put some sort of a clear line that at some point we should not accept that. Because if we do, doing nothing, the cost of not intervening is also there. You know, we often are very aware of the cost of intervention, the risk of over-intervening. We shouldn't forget that there is also a real social, political, and economic cost of also not doing anything. But where exactly to put that line, I think this is the big question, and I don't think we have a clear answer.
I saw 3 or 4 questions here around, I mean, the same idea on the impact of the industry, of the digital transformation on jobs. Are you all Schumpeterians here, and do you think that the impact of all this will be net positive, or are you more worried that it will destroy more jobs than it will create jobs?
I don't know but there's a time issue there. So it's not,
Of course, yeah.
and that transition can be longer or shorter, and that transition is going to be painful. So what the net result is, we don't know. There might be many new jobs, and new jobs might be better quality, whatever better quality jobs mean. But I think what we will see is that people in tech, and we've seen it already. You know, people that were in tech companies in the telcos. You know, when everything turned digital. I mean, there were many people saw their skills were not used, so they were hiring on one side and they were firing on the other. With the banks, the same thing. They're hiring big time, and they can't find the talent that they need, and they're firing at the same time. And that transition is going to be extremely painful. And that's something where the governments do play a role. I think companies, as far as I see, are doing quite a lot in training, because they just can't get the people, so they are setting up their own training schemes. But it is something that governments should really take a responsibility for, because and there's already algorithms that actually can predict the kind of skills that will go out of use, and basically you can actually find out how long your skills will last if you're not retraining yourself. And I think the really important is not to say we're going to stop this transition, or we're going to break it, or we're going to speed it up. No, this transition will happen, but it's how to make sure that the transition is not going to hurt a certain group of our population, especially that are already in a much weaker position, and then you get all the wealth effects that come with it. So I think managing the transition is a really important policy challenge.
Yeah, I would agree that I think actually there's a huge opportunity for it to be positive, but I do think it comes back to something that was raised earlier about education, and today a lot of the education that we see out there is just not adapted to the direction that we're headed in. Companies are providing the solution because they don't know what else to do, because the talent just simply isn't there. So I think a lot of it really does come down to education.
There's one interesting and almost philosophical question here. Is it possible that we are entering an era in which some know-how is more difficult to acquire, making it harder for other firms to catch up? Professor.
Not at all. Just one point on the future of work, because we've been working quite extensively on that. I think let's be very clear. We know today from academic works that when it comes to robots or software, yes, they substitute job. That's a fact. Now, the point is, again, what's the net effect? And the net effect will depend about, again, how innovative you are to recreate, obviously, companies and hire new people. So again, it's not a question we can answer as yes or no. It depends really about the outcome, how successful you will be to reinvent yourself. And again, I think that the skill that we have today, or the jobs that we have today, will be much more about being redefined and being category loss, because the jobs we will have is likely to be different, and that's a challenge for everyone. Concerning your question, the second question. Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah. I don't know the answer, but I can see that when we look again at the incumbent world, which is again 95% of the companies, the fact that companies tend to be at the frontier versus others is not linked to technology. It's actually linked to the way these technologies are absorbed and used into firms. And it's linked to organization, culture, ability to redesign and to exploit these technologies. So indeed, that firm specific knowledge and assets is usually quite important. And again, what we see today is the firms that are more amenable to absorb these technologies, try innovation, change their business models, are the ones that grow faster than the other one. And there's no sign of catch-up, because digital, by definition, hurts. It redefines the way you work.
Yeah, I think it's true to a degree. We've seen that a lot of the companies that have been growing the fastest in data analytics have been difficult to catch up. What happens is typically that they develop software. The software then becomes either white labeled or is open source, and it becomes accessible to a whole set of small companies that actually focus much more on the application layer. So when it comes to the hardcore data scientists, the hardcore machine learning experts, those people are in short supply. And so the ones that are actually building the algorithms and are maybe building the computers of the future, those are definitely in very short supply. But that knowledge, it gets translated, through different products and services back to the market, and get accessible then to a much larger group of developers that can actually use them. So it depends really on how the knowledge is used and how the technology is used. And I'm always surprised, actually, that there's so much technology being developed outside of these big companies. And just as a sheer number, I think Samsung has 60,000 researchers. And still they're setting up a unit that does innovation outside of the company, tries to attract knowledge from the outside. Because even within the company, with all of that knowledge, they feel that, that there's a certain path dependency in your thinking. There's certain tunnel vision. So you need that external, that inside out, of outside in innovation. So I'm not too pessimistic about it. But it's definitely the case that certain hardcore knowledge is accrued in certain places. On the other hand, what we see a lot in my country, and I think it's quite typical for Europe, is that we're really good in developing technology. So you'll find in universities, you'll find the top expert, but probably in Asia as well, in a certain technology, also in hardware, but in biotech, in all of these areas. The ability to make that into a business and to bring it to market at pace and at scale, that's somewhere where we are lacking. And that's an issue of capital, but it's also an issue of culture, because we really cherish the technology and the solution, whereas in the US sometimes you find that they cherish the market and the enterprise and the big idea, and they actually develop their business from the other perspective around. So we are very technology focused, and so it's not that we don't have the knowledge, it's not that we don't have the technologies, but it's the ability to scale at pace that we are lacking.
We've seen recently in many countries calls for more data protection, more protection on privacy, and in some cases in China, for instance, last week they passed a law saying that data should be stored on in the country, and that data was a matter of sovereignty. Are you are you worried by this trend to regulate more data and data protection, or is it necessary?
I think when it comes to personal data in particular, I'm definitely for it. I think that we've seen on numerous occasions, and we had some examples that were shown to us recently by different companies that are actually getting access to tons of data via different apps. You know, people, I don't remember who mentioned it earlier, but we see the terms and conditions, and now we just have a habit of accepting. We don't even look at what's happening to our data, where it's going, what it's being used for. And I think that if we're not regulating this, there's going to be a huge trend to be gaining and exploiting this data and what have you. But I do think something that really needs to happen is for users to become conscious of the data that they're putting out there, what it's being used for, and to actually gain control over that. There have been different businesses that have tried to actually say, why don't you sell us your data, and why don't you, give us this and that. And I think that's a model that's actually quite interesting. But regardless, I think when it comes to personal data, that's really an area that, for me, is very black and white.
We need more protection. Is it also your point of view?
Protection from what? Because a lot of this is about protection from intelligence agencies from abroad. Is that the protection you want? That's, for instance, what Microsoft did by collaborating with Deutsche Telekom, putting their data centers in Germany and giving basic control to Deutsche Telekom to manage the data centers. Is that what we want, or is it about privacy protection against companies? And how am I protected when my data is stored in the Netherlands? I mean, in the Netherlands, really small market. That's gonna if data can't circulate, it's also from a data security perspective, it's not good to have everything in one place. So and it goes very much against the grain of how the internet has developed. So I would be very cautious. Obviously, Europe is probably big enough, and our big countries, maybe they're big enough. But I think a country like ours, if we would have a data localization strategy, would be I think pretty short-sighted and not even tenable.
I think data protection is not a 0-1 scenario. So, of course, on the spectrum of data protection, many would agree that we need to empower us as the users. So there is room for greater protection of data. Where exactly you draw the line would depend on what exactly we're discussing. If we're discussing personal data, then certainly many of us would actually say that we don't care about certain things, mostly because we are unaware of the huge usage that this can have later on. It's very hard for us as individuals to quantify the actual cost of what we are agreeing to do. If you knew that by clicking something, you actually give me enough ammunition to then approach you with discriminatory pricing, be able to actually charge you more, then you will realize what is the true value of your data. But in that massive game, most of the time we're not aware of that. So this is one issue. Another issue is when you move from the competitiveness into the area of privacy, where we have other issues of data that are very problematic in terms of our rights, our exposure to society. So it is a rather complex environment when you think about data, but there is certainly room there to shift the balance slightly, and in some areas, especially in the area of competition law, allow us more effective control over what happens with our data, more effective control in our ability to engage in data mobility. So if I have data that you store, my ability to actually extract it and provide it to someone else to make use of it, in my ability to control it to some extent. And of course, there are the models that now discuss who actually owns the data. And if you make use of it, should I have a fair share of the gain that you made? So quite a big question mark.
And about this Chinese initiative to store the data in mainland China, is it something first realistic, and how do you see that?
I would argue that this is less competition and more politics and industrial considerations.
I think when if the companies in China become much more part of the global market, they will see the challenge becomes different. So, for instance, a company like Huawei is very keen on adopting global standards, and they are against national standards, locking things up nationally, because they are making much of their profit abroad. So when an Alibaba becomes an international platform or global platform for payments, they will want to be able to go cross-boundary. Obviously, if most of your market is still national, you can actually still lock it up. But data will need to flow if you want to do cross-border commerce. And so I think it's important that we understand a bit what the trade-offs are with these kind of issues. We want international trade, we want e-commerce, but we also want our privacy, and we want everything basically. But there are certain trade-offs, and those are determined by values and by political discussions. And I think we should have them, but have them on the core. And also acknowledge, I think exactly what you said, giving the power to the individual to manage their data better, to have more control over the data, give more transparency. Those are tools that can help very well to give people, make them more responsible how they use their data, also understand better and be able to react. Because as long as you can switch providers, then and you can vote with your feet, then, and if transparency can do that, then I think much of the problem has been addressed.
I think we will reach global standards at some point, and then we'll have some sort of world regulation or standards that will be implemented on a rather global scale.
Is a question?
I'm asking you.
Well, I don't think. Well, which global governance model at this point in time is proven effective?
I would say
what are ITU standards? You know, there are. So these exist, but there's. I think governance models like you were describing, I think, is pretty unlikely.
When you have externalities between jurisdictions, and when you have some winners and some losers, I think it's very hard to imagine a single code or a single approach. But what you will have are regional or multinational or regional areas where you have commonality of interest, and you can reach some sort of consensus. But I think on a global scale, you will find the same conflicts that you find when you deal with any sensitive area, and when you deal with something that involves both political industrial interests, but also sovereignty over data and what happens to your citizens.
I was thinking that the room should be able to ask some questions. Maybe I don't know. Is there a microphone in the room, or do they only come in through Twitter?
They're on the Vice Assembly, no?
Yeah.
It was nice to see who the question asker is as well. But there was an issue, a question around gender. I think because I do startups, so I get asked by all these different sectors. So are we, aeronautic sector, automotive sector, they all think that they're not as innovative as the other sector, and they're lagging behind, and they should do more with startups and all that. And it's striking is that there is always a gender issue. So it's not in tech. In tech, actually, depends where you are in tech. If you are in impact ventures, you see many more women. You see it's much more diverse. If you go all the way to chemicals and these kind of things, you see only men. But the worst statistic was, I think, at a conference I was last week on CFOs, and then everybody is white, middle-aged male in a blue suit.
I have a female CFO.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you all. And I hope it was interesting to you. Thank you for your time. And see you for the next session. We just need you to answer again the question, which was, where was it? Should we regulate more? Was it the question?
Make it fairer.
And should we do more to ensure fair competition? Yes, no, don't know. So 77% yes. Wow.
Is this the start or the end?
Yeah.
So who can tell us if it's the end or if it's the beginning? Is it the results of now or an hour and a half ago?
Yes.
This is now.
And before, we don't have the, we don't have the...
Been extremely unconvincing, that's clear.
We need to make more progress on access to data then. Well, anyway, thank you very much for your time. Thank you.